You know that saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The people behind Double Dragon Revive decided to fix it. They took one of the most iconic franchises of the 80s and 90s and gave it a new look. But was this update necessary? Or do the classic games, with their pixels and limitations of the time, still offer a purer and more fun experience? I know this is a good fight. That's why, in today's video, we're going to put the new against the old. We'll analyze the pros and cons of each without pulling any punches and find out if Revive honors the legacy or if it stays in the shadow of the giants. Let's go. The contrast between Double Dragon Revive and the franchise's classics in graphics and animations is a true clash of generations. In the original games, the charm was precisely in the technical limitation. The pixel art of Double Dragon in the arcade and on 8 and 16-bit consoles exuded personality. Every punch, every kick, every blink of the sprites had soul. The creative use of colors and the dirty urban visual, full of texture and flat shadows, conveyed a sense of weight and violence that marked the beat-em-up genre like no other. As for Double Dragon Revive, the transition to 3D is like seeing the Lee brothers through a new mirror, more detailed but also more controlled. The game abandons pixel art and bets on a modern look, full of lighting effects and cel-shaded modeling, with dynamic cameras and more vivid scenarios. Despite the effort by Arc System Works to preserve the essence, the new style tends to seem more generic. It's beautiful, but at times it loses that street punk trait and the aesthetic grit that made the originals breathe authenticity. In the classics, each enemy had an immediately recognizable profile, even with few pixels. Abobo's wide smile, the Lee brothers' blonde hair, and the exaggerated design of the gangs. All of this worked within the artistic language of the time and still draws attention for its limited but creative expressiveness. There is a poetry in the way the pixels moved, almost like hand-animated dolls full of imperfect charm. In Revive, the technical evolution is undeniable. The animations are fluid, with well-connected hits and subtle facial expressions during combos. Each character has a distinct movement. Marion, for example, now fights with her own style and a striking presence, gaining the action that was previously denied to her in the old games. However, this fluidity sometimes weakens the impact. Some players feel the characters look plastic or have inconsistent weight, especially in intense combat scenes. In terms of personality, the classics come out ahead. The pixel art, even limited, communicated an unmistakable visual identity. Revive, despite being more cinematic, seems to lack its own artistic heart. Something that other remakes like Double Dragon Neon managed to balance better with style and humor. Still, there is merit in seeing the effort to recreate the icons and give them new life with detailed modeling and pulsating urban environments. In the end, the result is a trade-off of character for technique. Double Dragon Revive shines in technology and animation, but the originals remain more memorable. The pixel art of the 80s and 90s hasn't aged. It has matured with time and continues to be the purest form of the series' elegant brutality. The new game impresses, but the old one continues to move with the strength of its grassroots style. The gameplay of Double Dragon Revive is a bold mix of tradition and reinvention, maintaining the classic beat-em-up DNA, but trying to modernize every punch and every dodge. The combat system has been expanded. Now characters have sequential combos of up to 5 hits, contextual grabs, and unique special attacks that vary by fighter. Maneuvers like the Hyper Blow and the Mid-Air Hyper Blow bring a touch of visual spectacle, allowing you to destroy entire groups of enemies or counterattack at critical moments. In the classic games, the moves were simple and direct. A basic combo, a precise kick, and the pleasure of using improvised weapons. The appeal was precisely in the limitation and the raw rhythm of the combat. Every movement had weight, and the difficulty, associated with the control response time, required muscle memory and precision. Revive, on the other hand, is more permissive. The automatic combo system and increased cancel windows make the flow more accessible, which might please beginners but takes away some of the brutality characteristic of the old days. The difficulty is a point that divides opinions. Revive tends to be more balanced, but also easier compared to the 1987 arcades, which were designed to punish the player and eat tokens. Here, there are checkpoints, devastating area attacks, and even powerful defenses like the Armor Blow, which allow you to resist damage temporarily. In contrast, veterans miss that tension of losing everything with one mistake. It's still challenging in boss fights and extra modes, but the curve is smoother and the punishment less cruel. Physically, combat has gained more freedom. The game abandons the fixed 4-direction plane to adopt full 8-axis movement, with wall jumps and parkour. It's exciting to see Billy do an acrobatic jump and continue the combo from above, but some find the control a bit floaty, meaning too light, with less weight than necessary in a good beat-em-up. The hits connect well, but the feeling of impact varies. In the classics, every blow felt concrete, like a dry punch to the flesh. In Revive, it's sometimes more stylized than physical. The new combos and special techniques offer variety that the old titles couldn't dream of. Playing with Marion, now with dashes and quick attacks, or with Ranzo and his elemental strikes, brings real diversity to the roster and encourages experimentation. The object physics have also evolved. Barrels explode, cars electrocute enemies, and the environment has become part of the combat arsenal. This integration brings freshness to the series, but it also moves away from the drier, more tactical rhythm that defined the first chapters. Double Dragon Revive is technically superior, but the classic still dominates in feeling. The new systems deliver fluidity and variety, but the old ones had artisanal precision and an emotional connection that only comes from decades of pixelated brawling. Playing Revive is fun, exaggerated, and cinematic. Playing the classic is visceral, straight to the point, and unforgettable. For those who grew up taking virtual punches in the arcades, the difference is feeling the hit, and not just seeing it in high definition. Billy and Jimmy Lee remain the heart of Double Dragon Revive, but now dressed in a new look and a more cinematic stance. Billy retains the essence of the technical leader, with quick punches and direct combos, while Jimmy brings a more aggressive and explosive style, with an emphasis on kicks and area attacks. Both received refined animations and more intense expressions, which reinforces the partnership and fraternal rivalry that always defined the two. The difference lies in charisma. The new visuals are impressive, but the simplicity of the old sprites still conveyed more street attitude, that quiet confidence of 80s heroes who didn't even need to say much to command respect. On the narrative side, there's a more dramatic touch to the brothers, with the post-war backdrop strengthening the story's dark tone. Revive tries to humanize them with dialogue and well-dubbed cutscenes, something non-existent in the classics. Although this adds depth, some miss the raw energy of the old days, when Billy and Jimmy spoke only with their fists. In terms of gameplay, however, the differences between them are more subtle than in the old games, bringing the styles closer in the name of balance, something that restricts that sense of identity each brother had in the 90s. The villains received special treatment. The gallery of classic enemies returns revamped. Abobo is even more colossal and brutal, but now with color variations and differentiated attacks that bring new mechanics to the battles. Linda has gained a leadership role, commanding areas and using traps as part of her arsenal. Williams and Roper have been reformulated as smarter henchmen with varied attack patterns. At the same time, there are new faces like Mine and An, the assassin sisters who expand the Shadow Warriors universe. This reformulation brings freshness to the franchise, but the contrast between the old cartoony designs and the modern models makes some lose part of the exaggerated charm that defined the arcade-era villains. Among the striking bosses and antagonists, Revive gets it right by bringing back legendary figures like Willy, Shadow Master, and Koga Shuko, all redesigned with more detail and presence. Willy, for example, has a militarized look and machine gun attacks in unpredictable patterns, being one of the most cinematic confrontations in the game. As for the classic bosses, despite their visual impressiveness, they don't always maintain the same mechanical impact as the old ones, where each fight had a memorable and cruel pattern. It's a spectacle for the eyes, but not always as challenging as expected. In terms of secret and unlockable characters, Revive goes beyond the basics and adds a progression system inspired by modern titles. Marion, once the damsel in distress, is now playable from the start, armed and with short and long-range attacks. Besides her, names like Yagyu Ranzo and Chin Seimei can be unlocked, expanding the repertoire of fighting styles. This inclusion is a notable evolution compared to the classics, where unlocking extra fighters like a Bobo or Chin Tai Mei required tricks or alternative versions of the games. Now, there are real incentives to replay and master various characters. Comparing the generations, the classics were about straightforward archetypes, heroes in torn t-shirts against brutal and exaggerated villains, and that worked. Revive tries to sophisticate, and although it manages to add depth and style, it sacrifices some of the spontaneity and the street aura that made Double Dragon stand out. The new cast is more diverse and technical, but the pixelated faces and straight punches of yesteryear still speak louder to the retro heart. Simple, brutal, and eternally iconic. The level design in Double Dragon Revive follows a more modern path, but without the boldness of the old ones. The game maintains the classic advance and beat format of the genre, with 8 linear and well-defined stages, but without alternative routes or great freedom for exploration. Each scenario brings a new setting: ruined factories, dirty alleys, destroyed bridges, and arenas with pulsating neon. But the progression is direct, almost like a restrained homage to the arcade days. Compared to the classic NES and arcade versions, Revive bets more on cinematic atmosphere than on environmental interactivity. What made the old ones special was precisely the simplistic but effective variety. A street, a rooftop, an elevator packed with enemies, and suddenly a villain throwing you into a river. Each stage felt like an episode in the Lee brothers' journey, full of rhythm and small surprises, hidden stairs, destructible objects, and strategic positioning. Revive, on the other hand, is more contained and follows the line of direct missions, focusing on continuous combat. It's beautiful, polished, and technically flawless, but it lacks that intentional repetition loop of the classics, the kind of challenge that made you play for the pure pleasure of mastering the map. Still, there are clever new elements that update the pacing. The combat parkour system brings moments of verticality, with jumps between platforms, aerial strikes, and controlled falls. This adds fluidity and gives identity to stages that were previously limited to pure 2D. Furthermore, some areas have environmental traps, electrical wires, explosive cars, breakable pieces of scenery that function as both a hazard and a weapon. In certain stages, throwing an enemy at the right spot results in devastating effects, something that pairs well with the new physical dynamism. Secrets and alternative paths are more discreet, but they exist. There are hidden Easter eggs like graffiti honoring the NES and Mega Drive versions, as well as subtle cameos, like Bimmy, the famous typo of Billy on the NES, appearing in the background of a stage, or old portraits of classic villains. There are also special challenges and hidden bosses unlocked by meeting specific requirements, a reward that nicely replaces that pleasure of trying to find a secret bug in the arcades. The focus is more symbolic than exploratory, but it shows that Arc System Works made a point to honor the franchise's history. In terms of atmosphere, Revive tries to preserve the street brawler spirit, but with a more epic touch. The dirty streets and alleys of the classics now shine under neon lights and rain effects, evoking a decadent yet stylish city. The result is cleaner and more cinematic, less sweat and blood, and more show and spectacle. The old ones had a natural grit, a raw energy embedded in every hit, while the new one is more stylized and safe. It works well to introduce the franchise to new players, but for veterans, it lacks a bit of the smell of rusted iron and the dry sound of punches on the pavement. In the final balance, Double Dragon Revive has technically excellent levels, but emotionally more restrained. The structure is modern, with anime atmospheres and 3D dynamism, but the underground soul of the originals, with their pixelated streets, oppressive alleys, and invisible dangers, still wins in authenticity. The new game understands the rhythm of the past, but translates it onto a more polished stage. It's like trading a stuffy basement for an arena of lights. It's still Double Dragon, but now more beautiful than dirty. The soundtrack of Double Dragon has always been the pulsating heart of the brawling, and in Revive it returns with force, but in a very different tone. The new game combines modern arrangements with synthesizers, distorted guitars, and electronic touches, re-recording iconic tracks like the main theme and the truck stage music, both with a cinematic feel. Some reinterpretations hit the mark, like the orchestrated version of the final boss theme, inspired by Double Dragon 2, which delivers an intense nostalgic rush, the kind that makes any arcade veteran pause for a second and smile upon recognizing the melody. In the classic games, the soundtrack had an almost magical role. The limitations of the sound chip created simple but catchy tunes that got stuck in your head for days. The theme of the first stage, for example, is one of the most recognizable songs in the beat-em-up genre. Aggressive, yet heroic, as if it summarized the entire spirit of fighting in the streets. The NES, the Master System, and the arcade had their variations, but all maintained a melodic essence that became a sound signature of the 80s. This minimalism is the kind of nostalgia that modern versions, no matter how technically competent, have difficulty capturing. Revive's soundtrack has studio quality and was signed by a heavy-hitting team: Rado, James Landino, Kota Takahashi, and Pejman Rusba, Funk Fiction, all bringing distinct styles, from electronic funk to progressive rock. This diversity creates a rich soundscape, with tracks that adapt to combat situations and dramatic cutscenes. It's a soundtrack that's more cinematic than street action, with an epic background structure, which pairs well with the game's new visual style, but sometimes sounds distant from the series' punk and gritty identity. In sound effects, there are clear advancements. The hits sound with more impact and texture, a deep crunch, simulating breaking bones and fists tearing through the air, especially in power attacks. Still, some fans found the sounds a bit too muffled, which takes away some of the aggressiveness the genre demands. The noises of weapons, explosions, and environmental destruction are detailed, but without that dry, metallic sound that made the classics vibrate with an almost tactile intensity. The voice sounds also have a presence with full voice acting that gives more personality to the fights, but the ensemble still lacks the lo-fi spontaneity of the 80s. The modern sound ambiance is immersive. There are echoes in warehouses, sounds of distant crowds, and the sounds of rain and wind in the urban stages. Everything is designed to create a three-dimensional panorama, and in this, Revive easily beats its predecessors. But the victory is technical, not emotional. The classic version sounded raw, and it was precisely this lack of refinement that gave the game life, as if the city itself were alive under the synthesized track. Revive is more elegant, but less visceral, more professional, but less memorable. In the final balance, Revive's soundtrack is competent and even beautiful, but the classics remain unbeatable in terms of soul. The new versions work as refined homages, with dense arrangements and cinematic atmospheres, but none replaces the pure synthesizer of the arcade. When the old 8-bit chords play, memory awakens. And that's when we realize that Double Dragon's sonic nostalgia doesn't come from the sound itself, but from the memories it carries. The story of Double Dragon Revive takes a bold step towards a more mature and darker narrative, moving away from the simplicity of the arcade days. The plot is now set 15 years after a nuclear war, in a devastated world where isolated colonies have replaced the old nations. In this post-apocalyptic setting, Billy and Jimmy live alongside Marion in a coastal city dominated by the Shadow Warriors gang, which rules with force and corruption. The plot begins when the brothers' dojo becomes a target of this organization, kicking off a journey that mixes revenge, resistance, and redemption. In the classic games, the story was the least important thing. A simple bad guys kidnapped Marion was enough to justify hours of brawling. This simplicity worked because it fit the arcade aesthetic, direct, symbolic, and universal. Revive, however, tries to elevate this concept, introducing dialogue, dubbed cutscenes, and a more cohesive world context. It's a more cinematic approach, but some fans feel that the excess of explanation takes away the charm of the mystery. Before, the narrative strength came from the environment and expressions. Now it comes from the lines and the more controlled structure. The impact of the new characters also shakes up the story's dynamic. Marion, who was once the damsel in distress, takes on an active role as a fighter and strategic ally to the Lee brothers, a modern symbol of empowerment that breaks the repetitive cycle of being a recurring victim. Another highlight is Marcus, a new antagonist with his own motivations, who brings tension to the battles and reintroduces the idea of physical and ideological rivalry. There's also Yagyu Ranzo, a mysterious warrior, and An, both adding layers to the plot by expanding the Sosetsuken universe and the forces surrounding the protagonist's legacy. These additions make Revive's world feel more alive and connected, offering something the classics rarely attempted: narrative continuity. The presence of new villains, like Linda and Raymond, reimagined with more important roles within the gang, creates a sense of hierarchical organization, which gives more weight to the final confrontation. Still, the focus on character development sometimes dilutes the characteristic pacing of the old games, which relied on the constant tension between action and challenge without needing long explanations. In terms of coherence, Revive is much more structured. It tries to justify the urban chaos with social and political reasons, the post-war decay, inequality, and the rule of force over law. The old Double Dragon didn't need logic. It was enough to know that good was fighting evil with its fists. This difference defines the contrast between the eras. The new game is more competent in visual narrative and writing, but it loses some of the instinctive brutality that made the old ones feel like a real fight for survival, and not a fable. In sum, the plot of Double Dragon Revive is denser and more contextual, but less spontaneous. It gains in ambition and depth, but distances itself from the purity of the original, that primal energy of the arcades when two brothers beat people up because it was what they had to do. Revive delivers a solid story, but the classics still win in spirit, simple, raw, and unforgettably human in their pixelated brutality. Double Dragon Revive hits the nail on the head by modernizing the cooperative aspect, bringing the best of both worlds: grassroots local multiplayer and responsive online co-op. The game allows two players to tackle the entire campaign together, both in split screen and connected via the internet, maintaining the spirit of playing shoulder-to-shoulder characteristic of the 80s arcades. There's even a system to revive your partner in combat and special synchronized attacks, the Dual Dragon Combo, where the brothers combine moves to cause area damage. The smoothness of the netcode is also a highlight, offering stable and fast connections between platforms like PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. The cooperative mode also brings an unprecedented strategic dynamic. Players can divide roles in combat, with one focusing on heavy attacks and the other on crowd control, taking advantage of the dual special skills system. This creates moments of improvisation typical of street fights, but with a modern tactical touch. For those who prefer the old school, the local mode preserves the arcade feel. 2 controllers, 1 screen, and the chaos starting in the first bar fight. Arc System Works managed to balance nostalgia with the connectivity of modern times, something many remakes have failed to capture. Another point that surprises is the customization. Revive introduces an RPG-like progression system, where the player can customize moves, unlock alternative costumes, and change the visual effects of abilities. Each character has a specific skill tree. Billy can specialize in concentrated strikes, while Jimmy focuses on defenses and counterattacks. Additionally, it's possible to unlock graphic filters that simulate the look of the classic arcade and 16-bit consoles, adding a dash of direct nostalgia to the gameplay. In the extra modes, there are options for side missions and specific time and combo challenges, ideal for those who enjoy practicing moves or competing for high scores. The Dragon Trials mode, for example, pits the player in a series of combats against waves of enemies with unique difficulty modifiers. All of this expands the replay value, something that was lacking in many recent beat-em-ups. Arc System Works clearly wanted to keep the game alive even after the main campaign, adding constant incentives to return to the battlefield. The Easter eggs and references to the past are a show in themselves. There are graffiti with sprites from the classics, signs with references to Techno's Japan, and even a fictional store called Retro Bros, filled with items named after characters from the original games. And there's a detail that keen-eyed fans loved. Characters from River City appear discreetly in the background in some stages, a direct nod to the shared origin of both universes, something that veteran fans of arcade culture recognized immediately. On the whole, Double Dragon Revive shines in its modern features without disrespecting its roots. The online co-op is solid. Customization gives new life to the characters, and the extra modes keep the experience fresh. But what really makes the difference is the care with details, the nods to the classics, the unlockable retro voices, and the references hidden on the walls of the stages. The game may be new, but the spirit is the same. Two-player brawling, lots of camaraderie, and a touch of nostalgia that never gets old. Double Dragon Revive is a worthy effort to bring the Lee brothers into the modern era, but it lacks something the classics had in spades: soul. The new visual is technically impressive, the combos are fluid, and the online cooperative mode is a step forward. However, many players and even former developers felt that the game lost the brutality and the weight of the hits that made the original unforgettable. The result is a beautiful and functional beat-em-up, but one that, in my opinion, feels more like a memory than a resurrection. The classics of Double Dragon, with all their toughness and simplicity, remain unsurpassed in charisma and impact. They didn't need complex narratives or cinematic cameras. The dry sound of a punch